Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if a question that you asked doesn't get answered in this video, you can go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. And please don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered, because I answer them in order of how many likes they have. So with that said, let's get started. So Brian Voter asks, what would you recommend doing differently when learning Chinese versus Japanese? Can you compare the challenges of each? For example, would you do anything special for tones? Is it easier to screw up your pronunciation by reading Chinese? So, in general, I would say, assuming that you don't already speak an Asian language that's similar to either Japanese or Chinese, so, you're a European person or American person or something, then learning Japanese and learning Chinese are going to be pretty similar in terms of difficulty and in terms of the challenges that you're going to face. And because of this, really the way that I would approach each language wouldn't be that different. Now, probably right about here, I should clarify that I'm assuming that you just mean Mandarin when you say Chinese, because if you're learning some other dialect of Chinese that's not Mandarin, that's going to greatly change things because you're going to have very few resources. So for example, if you're learning Cantonese, there's much fewer dictionaries and places you can go to get help for what certain things mean and just subtitles and things like this. So, if you're learning a language that has limited resources, you're going to have to employ a lot of strategies specifically to help you get around that fact. But that's not really related to the language itself. It's just related to the resources available for learning that language. So, assuming that you're talking about Mandarin, both Mandarin and both Mandarin and Japanese have a ton of resources for helping you learn them. So in that sense, they're about equal. And yeah, the specific challenges that the languages present are pretty similar, right? Like, in terms of the sound system, I think Chinese is more difficult than Japanese because there's a lot of subtle distinctions in Mandarin pronunciation that can be difficult when you first start learning it, like the difference between the X sound versus the SH sound. And there's some vowels that are pretty weird if you're an English speaker and so on. And so learning to hear all the sounds I think is a lot harder for Chinese, for Mandarin, because Japanese doesn't really have that many difficult sounds. The only real difficult one if you're an English speaker is the R sound, and really that's not even very difficult. And just listening in general I think is harder in Chinese because there's a lot of synonyms, even including the tones. There's so many sounds that can mean a lot of different things, and you have to infer from context which one it is in this specific case. And the sounds just all sound very similar to each other. There's not a lot of phonetic variety. And so I still struggle with the fact that so many words just sound like other words, and each word doesn't really have a really unique sound to it. It just kind of feels like they all just sound like shua shua or something. And so it can be really hard to remember when you're first starting out. Whereas I feel like Japanese it has a little bit of that issue, especially for jukugo or kanji compounds, but not nearly as much. And so, I'd say listening is just going to be inherently harder for Mandarin than Japanese. And I've heard a lot of people report that who has learned both. Like Yoga, I know, agrees with that, and other polyglots on the internet who have gotten decent at both. Pretty much everyone consistently says that getting good at Mandarin listening is harder. So there's that, but really the only way to actually get good at listening is to do tons of listening. So even though that I'd say Mandarin listening is more difficult, I don't really think that would change the way that I approach learning it. I mean, maybe I would bias myself to listening even more, but even so with Japanese, I'd say you want to bias yourself to listening over reading, just so that your listening abilities never fall too far behind your reading abilities, and so that you can walk away with a really good accent. And so, that's the difference, but I don't really think it would change the way I approach Chinese. And then, of course, the characters are about the same. I mean, the characters themselves are different because Chinese uses simplified characters if you're learning mainland Mandarin, and if you're learning Taiwanese Mandarin, then you got the traditional characters, whereas Japanese has their own version of simplified characters that are different than the Chinese simplified characters. But in terms of the challenge that they present, it's pretty much the same. Realistically, you need to know 3,000 to 4,000 characters to be truly competent in both Chinese and Japanese. And so I would approach it the same way with our RTK, with recognition RTK. And, there's a very strong argument in Japanese for why you shouldn't learn the readings of characters when you are initially learning the kanji. And it doesn't fully apply to Chinese. Like, you can make more of an argument for learning pronunciations as you learn the characters in Chinese, just because in Japanese, most kanji have at least 2 readings, sometimes many more than that. Whereas in Chinese, every character only has, most characters, a vast majority of characters only have 1 reading, and it's entirely consistent. And so it makes a little more sense to just learn the reading as you learn the character. And I think there's more of a stronger relationship between certain radicals and certain readings. And so as you learn a collection of characters that all share the same radical, if you also learn that they all share the same reading, then maybe you could see how that could be an easier way to learn, a more efficient way to learn. But overall, I still think it's better to just only learn the meanings of characters first and then learn the readings through learning words. Because trying to just memorize readings of characters in Chinese when you still completely suck and have no foundation in the language is going to be so hard. Because like I said, all the readings sound really similar to each other anyway, and they're not going to be completely meaningless to you. So just remembering that this character is sure, and this character is like sure, it's going to take a lot of mental energy to memorize all of that, and it's still probably not going to carry over that well to when you're actually trying to learn how to read real text and stuff. So I'd say it's going to be more efficient in the long term to just do something like recognition, RTH or whatever, like remembering the Hanzi, and after that, just start learning words, start learning sentences, and you'll learn the readings through that, and you'll very quickly pick up on all the patterns, like, oh, this radical is generally pronounced like this, and so on. So yeah, when it comes to the characters, I would approach Japanese and Chinese the same. And then the other big difference that you might be thinking about is that Chinese has tones, right? Chinese or Mandarin has 4 different tones plus a neutral tone. And so for each syllable in Chinese, it can either be pronounced as the high tone, the falling tone, the rising tone, or the falling rising tone, or the neutral tone. And so, yeah, of course, this is very important for both listening, comprehension, and pronunciation. And this is something that most Chinese learners are made aware of right from day one, and they start learning about and being conscious of from day one. Whereas in Japanese, we don't have tones. But in Japanese, we have pitch accent, which is actually very similar to tones. The only difference is that instead of functioning on a syllable level, it's functioning on a per word basis. So, a 2-syllable word in Chinese is going to have 2 tones, whereas a 2-syllable word in Japanese is only going to have 1 pitch accent for the entire word. But there are multiple pitch accent patterns. And so, in a sense, there's a lot of commonalities. Now, you might actually think that because in Chinese, every single word has their own tone, whereas in Japanese, there's only 1 pitch accent per word, that the Japanese pitch accent would be easier than the Chinese tones. But actually, this turns out to not be the case, because for Japanese, when certain things conjugate, or when certain suffixes are attached onto a word, or when certain particles are attached onto a certain word, that can change the pitch accent. And what this means is that when you first start pronouncing a word, you have to look at, in certain cases, you have to look relatively far into the future to know what pitch accent that word is going to be pronounced as, and you have to know that before you start pronouncing the word, because you can't change the pitch accent halfway through pronouncing the word, right? Since entire words have single pitch accents, you have to know what the pitch accent is going to be before you even start pronouncing it. And one example that I've used in the past, and I've covered this in the past, so I'm not going to go into that much detail, but for example, I remember hearing, listening to this YouTube video where someone wanted to say meiwaku garareru. So there's meiwaku, which is a noun, and then garareru, which is this suffix that can attach onto nouns and turn that noun into a verb that means something slightly different. And when you attach garareru, or garu, I don't know if it's garu, and then the conjugated form of garu is garareru. And it just happened to be garareru when I heard it. But when you attach garu onto a noun, it's going to change the pitch accent of that noun. So in isolation, meiwaku is a tamadaka, but in meiwaku garareru, then the meiwaku portion of the compound is going to become heiban. So in this video I was listening to, this Japanese YouTube video, this guy was reading a text, and he said meiwaku as if it was in isolation, and then he got to the garareru part and realized, oh, he had pronounced that part, the meiwaku, wrong. and you have to go to the beginning of the word and then repronounce it with the correct pitch accent. So this is one example where in Japanese, to speak with correct pitch accent, sometimes you have to be looking pretty far into the future. You have to know, am I going to add a suffix that's going to change the pitch accent to this word? Am I going to add a particle? Or is this verb going to conjugate in a certain way? And so it's forcing you to look pretty far into the future in order to speak correctly. And so it uses up a lot of your brain's RAM to speak Japanese with correct pitch accent. And even Japanese people trip up on this. Whereas in Chinese, because it's on a syllable by syllable basis that the tone is playing out, you only have to look at maximum one syllable into advance. Because there are certain combinations, like when you have two third tone syllables in a row, the first one becomes a second tone. And there's some rules like this, but they only play out at a maximum you only have to look at maximum one tone in advance, basically. And so because of this, every single syllable, you basically get a fresh start. And this greatly simplifies things. Also, every syllable, like every character in Chinese, usually always has the same tone. So, like, for example, the character that means thing, which is koto in Japanese, is shi, and it's the fourth tone. And it's always the fourth tone, no matter what compound it's being used in. Whereas in Japanese, that koto, in the onyomi of it is ji, it doesn't have a pitch accent because pitch accent only arises at the level of words. And so for every single word that has that same character in it, you have to memorize what the pitch accent is on a word by word basis. And there's no way to really confidently predict what it's going to be before you look it up. And so going about learning the pitch accent of every word is a much bigger ordeal in Japanese because individual morphemes don't actually have a pitch accent. Pitch accent only really arises on the level of whole words. So for every single word, you have to just memorize the pitch accent. Whereas in Chinese, the tones exist on a per character basis or a per syllable basis. And so once you know all the syllables, you can learn a new word and you can guess what the tone's going to be with very high accuracy. So in a way, tones are actually easier in Chinese, I think. And because of this, that would change the way that I approach the Chinese tones compared to Japanese pitch accent. So for Chinese tones, I would say learn about the tones, understand the tones right from day one, along with learning about the consonants and the vowels. And every time you learn a word, learn what the tones of that word are. Whereas in Japanese, there's so much you have to be worrying about with, basically, because in Japanese pitch accent is so complicated, you can't really understand it fully until you have some grasp of the grammar, because pitch accent doesn't really exist in isolation. It's totally affected by, how the grammar is functioning. And so trying to understand pitch accent before you have at least a little bit of a foundation in Japanese is just extremely difficult. Plus, you have a lot of stuff to be worrying about in Japanese. You have the conjugations, you have particles, you have the kanji versus the hiragana versus katakana, and the word order. And there's just a lot of challenges you face right up front when you begin learning Japanese. And throwing pitch accent on top of that, I think, is just going to lead to a lot of confusion and frustration. So in Japanese, what I recommend people to do is pretty much just ignore pitch accent for the first 6 months of your learning, and then start introducing pitch accent gradually. And I've talked about how I recommend doing that in the past. So that would be, and also, how I would approach tones is essentially learn about what they are in theory, memorize what the tones of the words are, and then when you're listening to Chinese, try to hear how the tones are actually playing out. And as long as you do that, you'll slowly just get better and better at actually hearing the tones. You don't have to do any special exercises or anything like that. All you have to do is listen to lots of Chinese and set an intention to pay attention to the tones, and you'll automatically get better and better at hearing them. Once you can hear them clearly, you'll be able to imitate them. So yeah, I don't really think it's that big of an issue, honestly. I think the only reason that it gets such a bad rap amongst Chinese learners is that they don't actually immerse. And yeah, lots of things are hard when you don't actually immerse, because you essentially get no practice, no exposure. You aren't even able to really perceive what's going on. So yeah, of course, if you don't immerse, lots of stuff's going to be going over your head and you're going to be struggling. So I guess to summarize, overall, I would approach Japanese and Chinese in a very similar way. I would still just start with kanji, approach kanji the same way, Hanzu if you're learning Mandarin. I'd learn a little bit of grammar, then I'd start sentence mining. I do a lot of listening, and less reading and then ramp up the reading over time as I get better. And Chinese listening is going to be harder, but all you can do to get better at listening is listen a lot, so nothing really changes there. And when it comes to tones versus pitch accent, I'd start tones in the beginning in Chinese, but wait 6 months for the pitch accent on Japanese. And that's about different. I would probably start speaking at around the same time. How I would go about speaking and everything would be exactly the same at that point. Learning to read, I think, overall, I think Chinese is easier than Japanese in a lot of ways. The listening and the pronunciation is harder in Chinese, I think. I mean, pronunciation in terms of learning to speak yourself is definitely challenging, but trying to reach 100% pitch accent accuracy is a lot harder than trying to reach 100% tone accuracy for the reasons I explained before. But at least when it comes to listening, learning to understand Mandarin, spoken Mandarin, is a lot more difficult than learning to understand spoken Japanese. And so there's that. But besides that, I think Chinese is easier than Japanese in a lot of ways. Like the grammar is easier. There's no conjugations. It's very simple. And like characters only have one reading. That makes it much easier. Like I said, there's no onyomi versus kunyomi. Every character just has the same reading and the same tone. So that makes things much easier. And so, like in Japanese, you basically have to learn 2 ways to say a lot of things, because there's the Japanese way and the Chinese way that was imported into Japanese. Whereas in Chinese, you only have to learn the Chinese way. So I think that also in Chinese, there's much fewer loan words. And that makes things easier, because in Japanese, you have all these loan words from English and other European languages that are put into katakana, and that's actually very challenging. So in a way, I think Chinese is a lot easier, especially if you're taking the perspective of how difficult is it to reach a near native level. I think Chinese is actually significantly easier than Japanese. So there's that. And I think there was one other thing I was going to say. What was it? Oh yeah, in Chinese, you also have the issue of dialects, because obviously China is a very big country, and depending where you are in China, you're going to hear Mandarin spoken in many very different ways, because for most people in China, Mandarin's not actually their native language. It's a language that they learned once they started going to school, and so they speak it with an accent that's based off of whatever their true native dialect was. And so I haven't really got this far in my own Mandarin studies, but I've heard that it can be very challenging to learn all these very different ways of speaking. Whereas in Japanese, there are dialects, but they're pretty easy to understand. They're not ultimately that different from Hyojungo. I mean, there are Japanese dialects that are very different, but even most Japanese people can't understand those. So learning to understand the dialects that are important to be able to understand, like, most kinds of Kyushu Ben and Kansai Ben and like Fukuoka and stuff, that's really easy, honestly, if you get good at Japanese. So I think the dialect thing is going to pose some challenges in Chinese, and there's probably other things like that. But generally speaking, I'd say they're pretty comparable. Overall, I'd say Japanese is probably harder though. Took a long time on that to answer that question. Okay, Normal Wario asks, in the June 30th Q&A, you said that your first meditation retreat was a vipassana meditation retreat, and you didn't like it as much as your second retreat, which was in a different style. I'm interested in hearing more about your opinion on vipassana retreats versus other types of retreats. So I find it interesting that you guys seem to be interested in meditation. So far, all the meditation questions that get asked get upvoted a lot, but hey, whatever you guys want to hear me talk about. So I've been on 3 meditation retreats at this point, and 1 10-day retreat and 2 7-day retreats. And so far, they've all been vipassana retreats. And to go into what vipassana is, so we have Buddhism, right? Pretty sure everyone watching this video has at least heard about Buddhism. So Buddhism is a religion. It's also a collection of spiritual traditions, and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and what it represents changes vastly depending on where you are geographically on Earth. So it's really a really vast thing, and that I think can make it hard to really wrap your head around. But when you're talking very broadly, there's three main schools of Buddhism. There's Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. So Theravada is the school of Buddhism that's the closest to what the actual original Buddha taught 2,500 years ago. And there are lots of scripture left over recording sermons that the Buddha gave. And so that kind of forms the essentially Bible for Theravada Buddhism. It's known as the Pali Canon. Pali was the language that the Buddha spoke. And so this is, one school of Buddhism. It was the school of Buddhism that I initially became the most interested in, because it's kind of like, oh, well, Buddhism's about what the Buddha taught, right? So wouldn't you want to go to the tradition that actually is the closest to what the Buddha actually taught? All the other guys are just fakes, right? But then later on, I realized that in a way, some of the later schools like Mahayana and Vajrayana, they basically took the Buddha's teachings and they took it even farther and they developed it even more. So in a way, it's kind of like how I did AJAT, but then after I got fluent in Japanese, I took it even farther and refined the method even more. So just because that Mahayana doesn't directly represent what the Buddha taught, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have really valuable things to offer. And if you've heard of Zen Buddhism, that would basically belong within the Mahayana school. Vajrayana Buddhism is basically Tibetan Buddhism. And so there's these three big schools. They all have a lot in common, but there's also a lot that differs between them. And especially the way that you actually practice meditation is very different. So, like I said, I'm most familiar with Theravada Buddhism, even though now I'm also interested in the other schools of Buddhism as well. And the other thing to kind of say is that Buddhism is practiced as a religion in many parts of the world. And even if you read the original scriptures, like you read the Pali Canon, like I said a second ago, which are the original texts that the Buddha gave, the Buddha did talk about things like reincarnation and hell realms and heaven realms and gods and things like that. I don't really believe in anything like that. And you don't really need to believe in anything like that to get value out of the meditation practices of Buddhism. And so really, when you look around the world, there are basically traditions of people who are very serious about practicing meditation and achieving real results when it comes to changing how their brain works and changing their subjective experience. And then there's other places where they really just view Buddhism as a religion, very similar to Christianity, where you basically just pray to the Buddha gods that you'll have a good reincarnation and that you'll be able to get enlightened in a future lifetime. And so when you actually go read about Buddhism on Wikipedia, it's going to have, the story about how Buddhism says that we get reborn thousands and millions of times, and the point of life is to get enlightened so that you can cease to be reborn, because living is suffering and you should want to no longer exist so that you don't have to suffer, or something like that. But if you really talk to people who are practitioners of Buddhism, they wouldn't explain it like that at all. They would just speak in terms of changing your subjective experience in order to make yourself a happier and more functional and less delusional person generally. And so, all the stuff that I'm concerned about is pretty much nothing. It's pretty much unrelated to the Buddhism as a religion. And so that can be why there's a lot of confusion around, because if you hear Buddhism, like with most things in life, you get curious about it, you look it up on Wikipedia and you read about it. But if you do that with Buddhism, you're going to not really get an opportunity to learn about the aspects that I'm actually interested in. And even if you go to the store and buy like Buddhism for Dummies or something, that book was probably written by someone who's never really meditated and doesn't really understand how meditation works. And so it's basically going to be the same stuff as a Wikipedia that are just telling you the like religious story of Buddhism, like they practice in Thailand and other Buddhist countries. So that's the issue. So there's like Buddhism as a actual practice, and then there's Buddhism as like a belief system and a religion. And in the actual practice of Buddhism, I mean, doesn't always end up like this, but as an ideal, they have that you should not be dogmatic and that you should never believe anything just because an authority told it to you. You should only believe things when you've verified it for yourself experientially. And that's what the Buddha actually taught. But in reality, humans are really bad at not being dogmatic. So there is a lot of dogmatism that still exists within even hardcore practitioners of Buddhism, I found, which is unfortunate. But at least as an ideal, they have that you shouldn't be dogmatic about it. So it really comes down to your own experience with it. So anyway, within the actual practice of Theravada Buddhism, taking a lot of time on these questions today, meditation, really, there's two different types of meditation, you could say. There's concentration meditation and insight meditation. So insight meditation, also known as vipassana, so vipassana means in Pali, like clearly seeing, I think, or seeing in a special way, literally, means that you are basically trying to get experiential insight into the true nature of subjective experience. And it would take a long time to explain what that means, or at least what it means to me. But they're basically saying that there's something more true about your subjective experience than what seems to meet the eye, and you can empirically verify this for yourself by training your mind to perceive what is happening moment to moment very, very clearly. So that vipassana is really just trying to be able to observe your subjective experience kind of with a microscope and really see, what is my subjective moment to moment experience made up of? How does it actually function? And so that's vipassana. Concentration meditation is basically just training your mind to be able to stay very focused on an object of choice. And it's essentially creating the microscope that you're going to use in vipassana. So in order to actually do vipassana, which is about investigating your moment-to-moment experience, you have to have a basic level of concentration, or it's just not going to work, right? It's like if vipassana is looking through the microscope, you need a microscope with at least a certain level of precision in order to actually learn anything new. So concentration is really just training the mind. It's a means to an end. There's no real, there's lots of benefits of being able to concentrate well on a really down-to-earth pragmatic level. Like, you're going to have an easier time studying and being effective at your job and so on. But in terms of Buddhism, as a practice, they don't really view concentration as an inherently good thing. It's only useful as a tool to help you do vipassana, which is going to help you discover the truth about your experience. And that's really what we're after, because that's really what transforms you as a person and fundamentally improves your life in a much deeper way than simply being able to be more productive at work. And so that's kind of vipassana. Now, Theravada Buddhism is practiced within many countries around the world. Like the big countries are like Thailand and Burma, and I think parts of Malaysia, parts of Taiwan. But the big ones, if you're in the West and you're reading about vipassana, it mainly comes from Burma and from Thailand, and in India in some places. And so there's different schools of vipassana, and there's different styles of vipassana, because vipassana basically just means a type of meditation where your goal is to gain more and more kind of precision when it comes to being able to observe your moment-to-moment experience. But there's a lot of different specific ways of going about that, right? And so the meditation retreat that I initially went on a couple years ago, the 10-day one, that was one a Vipassana retreat in the style of S.G. Goenka, I think is his name. So this is this guy who actually died quite a while ago, but it was an Indian guy who grew up in India. He grew up as a Hindu and then was converted into Buddhism, was taught a certain style of Vipassana from his teacher. He had really good results with it. And so then he started opening these Vipassana centers all around the world. And so these Goenka retreats is what my friends and I refer to them as, are the most popular Buddhist meditation retreats because they're totally free, and they have them all over the world. So like, I'm in Portland, Oregon. The closest Goenka center from where I live was in Washington. It was just like a 2-hour drive. They have other ones in California, and they have them all over the US. They have them all over the world. They even have them in Japan and so on. And so anyone can just sign up for one of these 10-day meditation retreats, and go and meditate at this facility for 10 whole days, completely free, including lodging and meals and everything. It's all paid for because this whole organization is run entirely through donations, which is pretty incredible. And I was really impressed with how they really are, like, this whole organization. It isn't a cult. It isn't a weird pyramid scheme. It's actually just trying to spread the practice of meditation, because the people who take part in the organization really believe that it's just they've benefited from the practice so much, they just naturally want to share it with other people and feel motivated to do that. So it's actually this really interesting model of how organizations and systems could potentially work in the future in society, where it's just run through donations. So at the end of the retreat, they're like, hey, if you benefited from this, then please consider donating, because this whole thing is run off donations, and enough people donate that it works. And I think it's because, especially in the West, a lot of the people who tend to get into hardcore meditation tend to be like people who have done well successfully, and I think they're seeking out more in life than just financial success. And so they tend to have a lot of money, and so they probably donate a lot of money, and so it ends up working out. But that's just my hypothesis. I don't know for sure. And so that's like kind of the positive aspects of the Goenka retreats. The downside is that they're extremely dogmatic. They teach one technique, and they basically tell you that this is the best technique. Every other technique, whether it's vipassana or some other meditation, every other technique is inferior. This is the best one. This is the true one. And you need to do this and only this, and you need to do it exactly the way that we tell you to do it. Otherwise, you're not going to get the right results. And they're completely closed-minded and dogmatic about this point. So, like, what I found is that there's a lot of different meditation techniques. Some of them work really well for some people. Some of them work, but that same technique might not work very well for other people. And for other people, a different technique might work for them. So meditation techniques really don't seem to be a one-size-fits-all thing, because we all have different brains, different neurochemistry, different genetics. And so what seems to happen with these Goenka retreats is that about 30% of people go on those retreats, and the technique works perfectly for them. They have an extremely profound experience on their first 10-day meditation retreat, and then they're totally sold. They buy into the organization. They buy into the dogma that this is the one true technique and everything else is bullshit. And they're just completely sold. Then another about 30% of people, they have an okay time. It goes decently well. They didn't have any mind-blowing experiences, but they see enough in the practice to continue on with it and keep going. And then the last 30% of people basically get nothing from it at all. And they're like, okay, that was a waste of time, and then they just leave, and they never really come back. So what happens is that 30% of people who the technique just happened to work really well for them, they stick around, they rise up through the organization, and they become the next generation of teachers, and they continue to teach this idea that this technique is the ultimate technique, and it works really well for everyone, and kind of ignorant to the fact that it doesn't work for a lot of people, and that everyone is different and everyone needs kind of unique instruction and guidance. Like, that's just not part of their teaching. Like, to go into it a little more, meditation can help with certain things and improve certain things, and it doesn't really affect other things. And when it comes to developing fully as a human being, there's many aspects of our psychology that we need to take care of, and meditation doesn't get to a lot of those. Right? Like, if the type of thing that you'd go to see a psychotherapist to get help with, meditation can help with some of those things, but a lot of times it doesn't actually get at those things. It's kind of working on different parts of your psyche and different parts of your brain. And so a lot of times what happens in meditation is when people start to concentrate more, old emotional trauma starts to come up. Sometimes the trauma that's coming up, their past trauma, is so intense that actually they can't deal with it with meditation. And so for those people, they need to either go get some kind of other help, whether it's psychotherapy or whatever. But in this kind of tradition, because one downside of Buddhism is that it developed before Western psychology. And so Buddhism as a whole, when you go into Buddhist theory, they had a very rudimentary understanding of psychology in the Western sense, and they kind of just write it off as something that doesn't really exist. And so this tradition, because it's a very dogmatic and traditional tradition, the Goenka one, they kind of have just adopted the traditional Buddhist views that no matter what problem you have, you just need to meditate it off. And that's the only answer. And so if you're having a really awful traumatic experience, well, just keep meditating. That's just part of the practice. It will go away eventually. And they don't really meet people where they're at. So some people, they go on these retreats, they have old emotional trauma come up, or they have some kind of really deep meditative experience that they don't know how to integrate. And they don't really get help from the teachers, because the teachers there will literally just tell you, well, just keep meditating, just keep doing the technique, don't ask questions. And so those people don't get the help they need. They leave retreat and sometimes end up really depressed or even psychotic because they kind of ended up biting off more than they could chew, and no one helped them to integrate that in a healthy way. And more on like how the teachers work. So the funny thing is that the guy who started this tradition, SN Goenka, he's been dead for a long time. Yet he's still the official teacher of these retreats. And so what happens is the instruction, the meditation instruction you're given, it actually comes from videotapes from the 90s of Goenka. Like they're in this old aspect ratio, and the video quality is not that good because they're so old, because he's been dead for so long. And so he's giving you the meditative instructions. And then there are physical teachers there, but they're assistant teachers. And they're basically just meditators who've risen up through the organization. And they will have check-ins where they'll ask people to come up in groups of 6, and they'll just go around and say, what are you experiencing? And you'll tell them, and then they'll pretty much they'll just tell you no matter what you say, okay, good, keep doing the technique. And like, that's okay, just keep doing the technique. And if you ask a question, they'll basically just kind of shrug it off and say, oh, just keep doing the technique, you'll understand later. You just need to do the technique more. And so you really don't get any help or guidance or reassurance from the teachers most of the time. That was my experience, and that's been the experience of my friends who've gone on these retreats as well. And so, yeah, they're just really inflexible, really dogmatic, really formulaic, don't understand how human psychology works. And overall, the retreat as a whole, it's almost like meditation boot camp. And that's, a lot of people say this because it's super strict. It's like you wake up at 4:30 in the morning, and then you meditate for an hour, get a little break, meditate for an hour, get a little break, eat lunch, meditate for an hour, and you just do this all day, and they're super strict. And so, like, when I went on that first retreat, I thought I was going to lose my mind. Like, to this day, that's probably, like, not leaving that retreat early and sticking it out for the 10 full days. To this day, that was probably the most difficult thing that I've ever done. Every single day I thought about going home because I was just bored out of my mind. And at that point, that was when I was very new to meditation. So I didn't really know how to meditate. And I ended up just being so overwhelmed by the boredom and the intensity of the experience, pretty much, that I couldn't actually engage in meditation because my mind was just kind of freaking out. And so I was pretty much just sitting there for 10 whole days, just thinking the same thoughts over and over and over, and counting down the seconds until I could go home. And I think a lot of people are going to have that experience if they're new to meditation. So yeah, that will probably give you an idea of what's not so great about those retreats. And then if I talk about my more positive experience with the other 2 retreats I went on, maybe it will help out more. So yeah, the second retreat I went on, it was also a vipassana retreat, but it was in the style of someone named Sayadaw U Tejaniya, and he comes from Burma, and it was a totally different style of practice. The Goenka style of practice, it's what's called body scans. So you start at the top of your head, and you imagine that your whole body, the whole surface of your body is broken down into like 1 inch by 1 inch squares, and you start at one square, and you just ask yourself, like, what physical sensations can I perceive in this square? And then you move on to the next square, and you just do the same thing. And you just go through your entire body, every inch of your body, feeling what you can feel, whatever that is, even if it's nothing. And then you just start over. So you're basically just doing that all day. And as you do that, your ability to perceive the details of the physical sensations in your body will get better and better and better. And then you'll start to develop insight, like the experiential insight related to, like, you know, how you're experiencing your body. And well, that's how it's supposed to work. and stuff. And there's actually maps of what happens as you get better in meditation. The most popular Vipassana map is called the Progressive Insight, and you can read about it and read in theory about how perceiving your moment-to-moment experience in different, perceivingly deeper levels of depth actually change the way your unconscious mind understands what you are and what reality is. It's going to be very interesting to read about. If you want to learn more about that, I recommend the book Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha by Daniel Ingram. And so that was that tradition, and that was how you practiced in that style of Vipassana. The style of Vipassana on the retreat that I went on 6 months ago was very different. It was more of an open awareness practice, is what they call it, where basically you just sit and you kind of just try to notice whatever you happen to be experiencing, whether that's a sound or a thought or a physical sensation or an emotion or a sight or anything. And you don't really have an agenda for what you're noticing. You're just trying to notice whatever is going on in the moment. And if you notice that your mind wandered, you just kind of come back. You can use the breath as an anchor, or you can use body sensations as an anchor. And I think this worked a lot better for me because I kind of have ADHD. I've never been diagnosed or medicated for it, but I think I pretty much have ADHD. And so trying to force my mind to do the body scans all day just made me want to go insane. But with this practice, it was fine that my mind was jumping all over the place and going to different thoughts, because that wasn't actually inhibiting my meditation. My mind could go wherever it wanted to, as long as I was aware of wherever it was at any given point in time. So throughout the week, I started to be able to see my mind and observe my experience more and more clearly. And that had really profound effects on how I understand myself and my ability to make behavior changes and things like that when I came back from the retreat. So it really had a lasting effect. And it just worked a lot better for me. It just felt like, oh, this technique just fits better with how my brain works, and I can actually engage with it productively. Whereas when I was trying to do the Goenka one, it was just like hitting my head against the wall over and over. But again, for some people, the Goenka technique works really well, and they end up having really profound experiences. So it's not like one's better than the other. It's that everyone is different. And so I do think there's validity in the body scanning technique. So it's not that so personally, I don't really resonate with it, but I think the problem is that they're too dogmatic about it. They don't admit that there's different techniques that work better or worse for different people. And this is just one technique that just works well for some people at different stages in their practice. They just have this view of like, oh, this is the one end all be all technique. That's the real problem with it. And so, yeah. And to also just give you guys more information about Vipassana. So probably the most popular style of Vipassana is what's called Mahasi style. So Mahasi Sayadaw basically means like master in Burmese, I think. So that's why like there's Sayadaw U Tejaniya. That was the lineage that I practiced in on the retreat 6 months ago. So it's the same Sayadaw as like Mahasi Sayadaw. Sayadaw. It's a Burmese word, so I don't really know how you pronounce it, but I can put links in the description. But Mahasi Sayadaw was a Burmese Buddhist monk from like 100 years ago. And he actually basically invented modern style Vipassana. Whereas before, traditionally, how meditation was taught is first you'd start with the concentration meditation. And this is within just Theravada Buddhism. But you'd start with concentration meditation. You'd get to the point where you achieve these states called jhanas, which are essentially flow states. So you get to the point where you can concentrate on anything completely effortlessly. And it can be pretty difficult to develop that level of concentration. And then once you can access the jhanas, then you start Vipassana. And this is how it was taught. But this wasn't very accessible to lay people, because getting to the point where you can access jhanas while you also have like a job and a family to take care of, and you don't have that much time to meditate every day, just isn't really feasible unless you're really naturally talented with meditation. And so Mahasi Sayadaw made up this style where you just start basically with Vipassana right from the beginning, but it was a kind of different style of Vipassana, and you develop concentration and the Vipassana insight together alongside each other. And so within the kind of the Western community of meditation, the original style where first you master concentration and then you do vipassana, that's known as wet insight. It's wet because you have the padding of concentration to make things go more smoothly. And then when you just do vipassana from the beginning, that's called dry insight. And once you start to get into deeper meditative states, you can actually have some very traumatic experiences when you start to realize that the way that when your unconscious mind starts to realize that the model it was using to understand reality has some really big flaws in it, and there are some pretty profound existential implications of what that means. And so there are certain stages of the meditative path that are actually very psychologically disturbing and terrifying. And once you get through those to the other side, you realize that things are actually way better than they were before. But there's that middle period where things can get very difficult. And so when you take the original wet path where you first developed very deep concentration before vipassana, it makes going through that rough patch much easier because deep concentration states are inherently very pleasurable. And it also just allows you to move through the states more clearly, because basically if you kind of imagine that the goal of vipassana is like cutting through a chunk of wood or something, it's a totally random metaphor, then if you develop concentration first, you have this like razor sharp blade that you're going to be cutting through with the saw. Whereas with the dry vipassana, where you don't do the concentration first, you're essentially sharpening your saw and cutting at the same time. So it takes longer, and you're not going to have as much padding when you get to the rough patch. So going through the rough patch can be a lot harder for dry insight, and it can actually be dangerous. A lot of people have psychotic breaks when they get to that point in meditation practice, and it's important to have a good teacher and have a good support group if you're going to take meditation that far. If you are just doing like 30 minutes to an hour of meditation a day, you're probably never going to get to that point. It's like getting fluent in Japanese, right? You have to actually like really put in a lot of hours and a lot of dedication, and probably be going on retreats to seriously get to the point where you're starting to experience any of that real stuff that they talk about in the Progress of Insight. But some people are really gifted and they just run into it with only a little bit of meditation a day. Some people run into that stuff without any formal meditation, just through living their life. So everyone's different. But in general, you don't really have to worry about that stuff happening if you're not really putting in a lot of hours into this. And so, yeah, so basically the Mahasi Sayadaw style, that this guy Mahasi Sayadaw 100 years ago in Burma, he invented dry insight as a way to help spread meditation to lay people in Burma, because it's more accessible, right? Because you don't have to master concentration first. And this style of vipassana, like basically what you do is it starts off with this technique called noting, which is where you start just paying attention to the rise and fall of your abdomen as you breathe. But whenever you notice your mind go to something else besides your abdomen, you note whatever that is. So if you notice yourself like daydreaming, then you can say daydreaming. Or if you notice yourself worrying, you say worrying. Or if you notice yourself listening to a sound, you can say hearing. Or if you notice yourself looking at something, you can say looking, or laughing, liking, walking. And so you add a verbal mental label. You don't say it out loud, you just do it in your head, but you add a mental label to whatever you're experiencing. And this helps you grow mindfulness. And what mindfulness really is metacognitive awareness. So it helps you become more aware of what you are experiencing moment to moment. And it's a very powerful technique. I use it a lot still and recommend it, because by labeling whatever you're experiencing, that uses up a big chunk of your cognitive mind. And because you're using up that cognitive mind in the meditation, then you're basically using your cognitive mind to meditate instead of trying to fight your cognitive mind, because your cognitive mind normally is going to want to go and think about things like what you're going to do tomorrow and what you're going to eat for lunch and how embarrassed you were yesterday when you did that stupid thing. And so if you can basically take that power that's normally going to be used to distract you and instead use it to actually help your meditation. And as you start to develop in the practice, you start noticing more and more things per second, and eventually gets to the point where you have to just drop the mental labels because it's way too fast to label everything, right? Like you can get to the point where you're noticing 10 plus things per second. in terms of your experience. And that's kind of the goal with vipassana, is you start to really be able to break down your experience almost on like a pixel to pixel level. And that's where the insights come from, when you start to see how your experience is actually constructed. And so eventually you do drop the labels, but the labels are kind of like helping you get into that place where you can have very deep mindfulness without any labels. Because if you just try to just be mindful without using something like labels or using something like a concentration object, then your mind's just going to wander, and you're just going to end up thinking about random crap and then realizing 10 minutes later that you weren't meditating. And so, yeah, you kind of need a certain level of concentration and mindfulness to be able to just be mindful in a open awareness style really strongly. And so I mean, it's not impossible. Like the meditation retreat that I went to, the Sayadaw Tejaniya one, actually was kind of just open awareness without any labels. I used some labels on that retreat, like labels meaning noting, but it can be a very useful tool, especially when you're not on retreat and your mind is more all over the place. Using the labels can be very helpful. So that's the most popular style of Vipassana. If you look up Vipassana tutorial, you're probably going to get noting instructions, and those come from Mahasi Sayadaw. Like if you look up like Sam Harris meditation, Sam Harris mainly practiced in the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition. And so when he gives instructions like in his app, I haven't looked at it, but I could bet that it's probably going to be like Mahasi noting instructions. And so that's the most popular style of Vipassana in the West, for good reason. It really does work for a lot of people. The downsides are that it can be very effortful, and it can be very kind of goal oriented when you're trying to like notice all of your experience. You kind of have an agenda in a way, especially if you start reading about the progress of insight. You start to feel like, oh, so my goal is to get to the next level. And once you're trying to get to the next level, that's taking you out of simply observing what is happening in the moment. And so there's that issue, especially for Westerners who tend to be very goal-oriented. And that's why the Sayadaw Tejaniya one, which emphasizes more effortlessness and being present and letting things happen however they're happening, can really be, for me, that was really important, because it kind of counterbalanced my tendency to just strive, which gets in the way of meditation. So there's that. But I think that, so I think the, going back to the retreats. So the retreats that I went on, they were real life teachers who had studied with multiple other teachers for many years. And they understood that no technique is going to be a one-size-fits-all thing. Everyone is different. Everyone has a different past. Everyone has different karma. And so you need to give individualized instruction. And there was Q&As at the end of every day that I was at those retreats, where people would be able to raise their hand, talk about what they're experiencing, and get advice from the teachers, and everyone else could hear that. And it was much more, I felt like I really got the guidance that I needed, and it was useful to hear other people giving guidance or receiving guidance, because, you know, we all struggle with similar things. And so it was, and also from what I gathered, they understood the importance of psychology. They understood that this meditation isn't a one-size-fits-all thing, and it's not going to magically fix every problem in your life. They were much more realistic, seemed to have a much more holistic understanding. And it just wasn't cookie cutter like the Goenka retreat. It was actually like, just had a much more human element to it. And it cost money. That retreat wasn't free, but it wasn't that much. And I got a lot more out of it because of the being able to work directly with real teachers. I think that's super important, rather than just watching videotapes of someone who died a long time ago. And the techniques happen to work better for me as well. So yeah, that's kind of my view on it. Some people go on Goenka retreats and they just do their own practice and they ignore the actual instructions because it's free for 10 days. And so that's one thing you can do. I wouldn't do that unless you're already a very experienced meditator. If you really want to take your meditation practice to the next level, I would listen to a lot of different meditation teachers give talks on YouTube and online, or read a lot of books, and then try to go on a retreat with a teacher that you know you resonate with. It's much more likely that you're going to have a really powerful experience if you do that, in my opinion. And that's the cool thing about meditation, is it's not so big that you can find a teacher you like and you can go on retreat with that teacher. Like in 6 months, I'm going on a longer, no, not 6 months actually, in June, in month 6. I'm going on a longer meditation retreat, an almost 2-week retreat with someone named Lee Brasington, who is someone who I've been following for a while, and he's pretty famous within the meditation community. He wrote this book called Right Concentration that is like pretty famous, and so, but I got to go and get taught by him directly for 2 weeks, so it's pretty cool, and it's not actually any more expensive because at the center that I go to, you only actually pay for the facility, for the food and the lodging and the maintenance fees. And when you actually sign up for the meditation retreat and pay the bill, you don't actually pay any money to the teacher. What happens is that at the end of the retreat, you donate however much money you want to the teacher that you feel is appropriate based on what you received and how much money you're able to give and things like that. And so if you are really poor, you don't have to donate anything, but you can just donate a little bit, whatever amount you're able to, and you can go on a retreat with the most famous teacher, at least at this type of facility, and it doesn't cost any more than going on a retreat with some random guy that you don't know. So that's what's really cool, because they really, part of the philosophy is that these teachings are something that are priceless. They can't be bought and sold, and of course we all have to get money to pay our bills, but they don't really subscribe to the idea that, oh, I'm a more famous teacher, so I can take more money from you. That kind of goes against the philosophy of it. And yeah, now the interesting thing on the 2 retreats that I've been to is that they were definitely, like, the teachers, although they were much more flexible than the Goenka retreat, they were definitely still Theravadan Buddhists. And I definitely felt that they were a little bit dogmatic about Theravada Buddhism. They were much more open. They would draw from different teachers and different lineages. They would mention Mahasi Sayadaw or Ajahn Chah, or even sometimes quote, sometimes even they would even quote outside of Theravada Buddhism, sometimes even out of Buddhism totally. But in general, they felt very locked into the Theravadan Buddhist framework. And for me, although my practice mainly revolves around Theravada Buddhism techniques, I kind of just view Theravada Buddhism as one paradigm, one model of how spiritual development works. And there's other models that have other strengths and weaknesses, and there's no real reason to limit myself to one model. And all my other meditation friends feel similarly. So that was one thing that I kind of felt like wasn't ideal, was although they were way less dogmatic than the Goenka people, they still seemed to be kind of in a certain frame, but it's okay. It was still really useful. That's the nice thing about modern day is, you have the internet, you can access as many different teachers and teachings as you want. And yeah, so I just realized I was realizing as I was saying it, but basically spent an hour on just these 2 questions. Maybe I can run through some other ones really quickly. Like I said, this was the second most upvoted question, so hopefully some people will want to hear this. Okay, let's try to go rapid fire. I'm really bad at this, as you guys probably can tell, because I clearly like to take my time answering these questions. But so Billy asks, what are some effective ways at using friends who are native Japanese speakers to help you learn Japanese? The MIA process seems pretty solo until you start outputting. I wanted to see if there are ways to leverage native speakers in stage 2 or 3. So before you start outputting, pretty much the only thing that native friends are good for is input and motivation. So if you have a Japanese friend, for example, who can speak English decently well, then you can do this thing where you speak to him in English and he speaks back to you in Japanese. And that can be cool because you're getting Japanese input and you're getting human interaction at the same time. So, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And so I used to do that with my Japanese friends. It was cool. And so that's input, but in terms of practical benefits, it's not going to be any better input than you just watching a TV show. So, I mean, you're not getting any special benefit from them, but hey, it's still Japanese, and so it's still input, so it's still going to be benefiting you. But the second thing is motivation, where a lot of times talking to another human being in Japanese, or even just interacting with a friend who speaks your target language, that's going to motivate you to continue studying that target language and trying to get fluent in it. So that's the real benefit, is pretty much just motivation and extra input. And a lot of times we all have desires for human interaction. And so that's a way that you can fulfill that desire without leaving your target language. So that's another benefit too. But practically speaking, the native speakers don't really become useful until you start outputting and you can start asking them to point out whatever sounds off about your speech. So Misha asks, do you think that people raised bilingually/multilingually have an advantage when it comes to acquiring different phonetic systems? So I guess there's two ways to think about this. One is that if you speak two different languages, then you are going to, as a baseline, have access to more different sounds and other phonetic features than someone who only speaks one language. So when you start learning a foreign language, the more sounds in your target language that don't exist in any of the languages you already know, the more challenging it's likely to be. And the more sounds that you have in your repertoire when you start off with, then the fewer new sounds there's going to be when you approach a new language. So in that practical sense, they're going to have an advantage because basically they start off with more ground covered than someone who's monolingual. But this, again, it depends on what languages you know and what languages you're learning. Because it could be that you know languages A and B, but when you start learning language C is filled with sounds that aren't in language A or B. So the fact that you're bilingual might not be helping you out in that same way. So in that sense, having a larger phonetic repertoire as a baseline definitely can be very useful depending on what the languages are and what the target language is. But the other question is, does just the fact that you know two languages inherently improve your ability to pick up entirely new sounds? And that, I would say, I don't know, maybe. It kind of seems like, yeah, that could be the case. It could be that if your brain, from the time that you're a child, you speak multiple languages, then your brain is inherently aware that different languages are a thing that exists. And that maybe would lend itself to your brain having just more flexibility when it comes to learning new things like that. So maybe the fact of knowing two languages makes your brain more flexible when it comes to learning other languages in the future when you're an adult. I wouldn't be so... there's no way to know for sure, though, until they do studies and stuff. And even if this is the case, I don't think it would make a huge difference. I think it might be more minor. So Andrew asks, currently, I get on average about 5 hours plus of passive immersion and 4 to 5 hours active. As a person gets past the basic fluency level to fully understanding average native material, would that time immersing at work start to be considered active immersion because you could understand it more like your native language? To be more clear, at work, it's often semi-active because my job is so mindless, but I often zone out if I don't fully understand. Basically, I'm asking if my semi-active could be considered more towards active at that time, and I could get better exponentially, the time counting close to 10 hours a day because of at work. I know my active immersion is supposed to be your full attention, but I feel that can happen with my job since I've listened to history audiobooks in English and learned a lot and remember most of it. Another way to look at this being, at your level, do you think listening with headphones while jogging, chopping wood, or any muscle memory type of work could be active immersion? Thanks. So he says he added onto it a little bit. Sorry, that was all over the place. I also forgot to mention, if your level is at the point that you can effortlessly enjoy average level immersion like Terrace House or Slice of Life's. So really, the distinction between active immersion and passive immersion ultimately is arbitrary, because what the reality is there is a spectrum where on one end of the spectrum you're paying 100% full attention and just dialing in to notice as much as possible. And on the other end, we have total background immersion where you're almost actively ignoring it and you're not really paying attention to it in any way, shape, or form. And so whatever type of immersion you're doing, it can be anywhere on the spectrum. So for the sake of convenience, I like to make some draw some lines in the sand and say, okay, well, over here on this end, that's called active immersion. Over here, that's called passive immersion. And then over here, we call that background immersion. But where exactly you draw the line is mostly arbitrary. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter, right? All that matters is the closer you are to this side of the spectrum, the more that you're going to benefit from your immersion per hour. So saying like, oh, well, if I'm paying full attention while I'm doing mindless work, am I over the line where it's active immersion or am I below the line? Well, it doesn't really matter because those are just arbitrary distinctions. What matters is, yeah, if you're paying a lot of attention, that's going to be really good. And you're going to benefit more than if you were paying less attention. And that's just really the way you want to think about it is, yeah, pay as much attention as you can for as much time as you can. And that's going to be the formula to get better as much as possible. I just realized it's almost like the difference between a violin and a guitar. So guitars have frets, right? Which means that, the whole neck of a guitar is split into these little chunks. There's the lines. And if you put your finger anywhere between two lines, it's going to make the right note because it's going to round. Even if you're not pressing directly on the fret, because you're pressing the string down, the string is going to be touching the nearest fret. So it kind of rounds up to the nearest fret. Whereas on a violin, there's no frets. So it's going to make whatever sound your finger happens to be at. So if your finger is even a millimeter off, it's going to make a slightly different sound. And that's one reason that violins are very challenging. So in the same way, that's like with immersion, right? There's no frets for immersion. It's like violin. So like the closer you are to this end of the spectrum, the better you're going to be doing. Now, I would say that even for me, even when you're totally fluent, when you're listening while you're jogging, you're not going to be getting as much as if you were listening and paying full attention. This is even my experience with English. When I just sit on my back in my bed and listen to an audiobook and I'm fully paying attention to it, I retain and understand a lot more than when I'm jogging and I'm looking around at scenery and I just have less total mental resources because I'm exhausted a little bit, like I'm exerting myself. And so although, yeah, you can get a lot, I'd say it's like 80% maybe when you're jogging or doing some kind of activity. It's not 100%. And it depends on the type of material too. Because if I'm listening to an educational podcast that's quite difficult for me to really follow along with, even if it's some kind of mindless work, I might not be able, that mindless work might be enough to throw me off. Whereas if it's just some random YouTube video of some guy talking about YouTube drama, well, then that's no problem. I can fully follow that while I'm doing other work. So it depends on the content as well. But yeah, if you are doing mindless work and you have, let's say, 80% of your mental resources to pay attention, that's really good. And yeah, you're going to make a lot of progress from that. It's going to help you a lot. It's going to be more beneficial than passive immersion where your mind's constantly going in and out and you're not as tuned in. But yeah, ultimately those distinctions aren't really important. So Matt asks, yo, Matt, are you familiar with Xiaomanyc's content on YouTube? Have you considered making content like this? I think it would do wonders to bring attention to MIA as well as be super motivational for language learners when the going gets tough. So yeah, I know Xiaomanyc. Most of the people watching this probably already know who he is. He's this American guy who has become really fluent in Mandarin Chinese. And he makes these videos where he walks around Chinatown in New York and he pretends he doesn't speak Chinese, and then he randomly starts speaking fluent Chinese and films the Chinese people's interesting reactions. And I enjoy watching them. They're really fun. It definitely motivates me to learn Chinese. And actually, I talked to him about 5 years ago, back when he actually has 2 YouTube channels. He has his Xiaomanyc YouTube channel, where he's doing the type of stuff I just talked about. I think originally it was actually targeted at Chinese people, and he would be speaking Chinese the whole time, and he wouldn't put English subtitles to it. But then he started making this type of content that's more targeted towards English speakers, where he's basically just filming Chinese people's reactions when he busts out his fluent Chinese. And those videos started to go really viral and do really well. So he's kind of just like, okay, cool, let's keep doing this because this is working really well. But he used to have another channel called Ari in Beijing. I mean, it still exists, but he's not active on it anymore, where he would make videos about language learning. And he's very inspired by AJAT. If you listen to the stuff he says, he's talking about immersion and Anki and things like that. So yeah, he's inspired by AJAT, and apparently he really is like really good at Chinese. I can't judge, I'm not good enough, but from what I've heard from other people, apparently he is really good. And I actually contacted him 5 years ago before I had a YouTube channel. I mean, I think I had a YouTube channel, but I only had a couple of videos and I had like 2 subscribers or something. And he only had like 1,000 subscribers or something. And I contacted him and we talked for an hour. He told me that he did read AJAT and was inspired by the website. And, we just talked about our language learning experiences, and he was a cool guy. So yeah, it's really cool to see him blow up and get famous, because it's like, oh, hey, I talked to that guy one time back when no one knew about him. And would I consider making content like this? Yeah, I probably will. Probably will. Definitely would be good for the channel, get lots of attention. I mean, I just made the VR chat video. It's kind of in the same vein. Making the videos where I go out in person, that's a little harder because, well, first of all, I need to get more vlogging equipment. I need to get like the type of microphone that's cut out for that. And I need to get like one of the tripods that let you hold your camera. And I need to get someone else to film me, which wouldn't be too hard ultimately. But the other thing is that Japanese people generally don't want to put their face on the internet. Like even actual Japanese YouTubers will sometimes hide their face. So I think if I just walked up to a random Japanese person with a camera, or like I just walked up to a Japanese person and they can see that there's another person holding a camera, they're just going to freak out and be really uncomfortable. And it's going to be hard to get a good reaction. So I'd either have to hide the camera and then do it, and then be like, hey, I was actually filming this whole interaction because it's just for a YouTube video. Can I put your face on YouTube? And they'll probably say yes, just because Japanese people are really bad at saying no, even though in reality they're probably going to want to say no. That's going to be awkward for me, and it sounds like that's going to be hard, but I'll probably still try to do it at one point. Like, I know people do love those videos, so it would definitely be good marketing for the channel and help get more people into effective language learning. So it'll probably happen, but maybe for now I'll stick to the VR chat type videos. So Archfox asks, what are your thoughts on using the vacation add-on to take certain days off from doing Anki in order to have more time to dedicate to active immersion during the week? Would this be a good strategy for those of us with very limited time to increase the amount of active immersion on a daily basis? My thoughts were to try having 2 to 3 days off from doing Anki and getting an extra 1 to 1.5 hours of active immersion during those days. Love to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks. So I think it's important to separate total amount of time spent on Anki versus when you're spending time on Anki. So if we're thinking on a per week basis, right, there's how much time are you spending on Anki per week total, and when are you spending that time? So those are 2 independent things that you don't really want to conflate. So the first question is, okay, you only have this many hours to spend on Japanese per week. How many of those hours do you want to spend on the SRS? And I've talked about that in the past. I think roughly 1/3 of your total time, I mean, with other caveats, but 1/3 of your total time you should spend on the SRS. So the next question is, when should you spend that time? Because the default would be, well, if you're going to spend 7 hours per week on the SRS, spend one of those hours each day, right? Or whatever, like basically however many time you're going to spend on the week, divide that by 7 and do that many each day. That would be the default, right? Because that was really the only choice before the vacation add-on. But now that we have the vacation add-on and we can take certain days off every week, like we can say, okay, we're never going to rep on Saturday and Tuesday. Now this opens up the possibility of actually not just evenly distributing the total amount of time, but maybe blocking it in certain, like blocking it up, chunking it up in certain ways. And this, I think, is very interesting and may actually have a lot of potential. So I think it would make sense if, for example, you have some days of the week where you have a lot of free time and other days of the week where you have a very limited amount of free time, that you set up the vacation add-on so that you're only doing Anki on the days where you have a lot of free time, and then on the days where you have a small amount of free time, you're only doing immersion. And so, again, you're not changing the total amount of time on the SRS, but you're distributing it differently, and I think that could end up with a more optimal result. But this isn't something I've experimented with personally yet, and so I can't speak with confidence on this issue, but I think hypothetically it makes a lot of sense, and I think it's going to be cool to have other people explore that in the future, report back their results, and we can learn more about it. So as of now, without having any firsthand experience or hearing any case studies, I think that, there's a lot of potential there, especially for people with more limited time to spend on the SRS. Let's see. Robert Windtaker asks, what would you recommend for somebody who fell off the wagon and hasn't immersed or studied Anki in over a week? The reviews are stacking up and it seems intimidating to jump back in. Well, we created the vacation add-on just for that. There's a feature in the vacation add-on called the catch-up feature, which takes all of your currently due reviews and spreads them out into the future at whatever pace you choose. And it does this in the most optimal way possible. So what I would say is get the vacation add-on, use the catch-up feature, maybe spread up your reviews over the next month, and just start immersing and start doing whatever reviews are due that day. Pretty simple. Ganizmit asks, should we add sentences containing known words but used with different kanji? For example, hoeru, hoeru. Or maybe add vocabulary card with different kanji. So I think it depends. So he's saying if there's some words can be written with multiple different kanji. So he's saying, if you have a single word that can be written with multiple different kanji, should you have two different cards for those? So I would say, first of all, when you first learn a word, even if there's multiple kanji, only learn whatever kanji the word was actually being written with when you came across the word. And don't worry about the other ones. So that's the first thing. So never try to make two cards at the same time for different readings of the same word. But if you are reading, you come across a word that you learned a long time ago, but that word that you've known for a long time is being written with a different kanji, then in some cases, it might be a good idea to make the card. The question you have to ask yourself is, do I need a card to remember this? If you think the answer is yes, because it looks rare and it's a weird kanji, then go ahead and make the card. If not, then don't. That was what I always did. So sometimes I would make different cards for different kanji because it was hard to remember. And you said maybe just make a vocabulary card instead of a sentence card. Yeah, you can do that, but be careful because sometimes changing the kanji slightly changes the nuance of what the original word means. So in that case, you do want to learn a different sentence card if the kanji is changing the nuance, because whenever you're dealing with the nuance of words, you want to be using a sentence, not an isolated word. So, okay, last question. Genro asks, I want to learn how to build Anki decks from scratch. Where and how should I start? That's like what do you mean an Anki deck? What kind of Anki deck? You want to make a sentence deck? You want to make a kanji deck? I'll assume that you're talking about making a sentence card deck because sentence cards are the most highly recommended form of cards here at the Mass Immersion approach. And where and how should you start? Well, start by consuming content in your target language, finding 1T sentences. These are sentences where you know all of the contents of the sentence except for one word. Look up the unknown word. See if the sentence makes sense. If it does, put that on the front of a card. Put the definition of the unknown word on the back. Click Add to Anki. And keep doing that until you have as many cards as you want. And you can get a lot more sophisticated with it. You can use Morphman. You can use subs to SRS. You can... There's lots of more complicated things you can do that I've talked about on my channel and on the website. If you're really new, you can check out the MIA Japanese Quick Start Guide. Give a lot of advice on there. But that's about it. If you're talking about more technical Anki advice, then I have a lot of Anki tutorials. A lot of other people have Anki tutorials. I recommend just Googling for whatever you're looking for on YouTube. But yeah, your question's pretty vague, so I don't really know how to help you more than I have now. If you want to clarify what you were really wondering, then go ahead and write that in the comment section, and I'll try to answer you. So yep, that's about it for this week. This was an interesting new style of spending a super long amount of time on the two most highly voted questions, and then went rapid fire through the other ones. Let me know what you think if you actually listened to the whole thing. And thanks so much for supporting, and I'll see you guys next time.